Kankakee Marsh, Indiana, September 1884. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying sedge, carried the rhythmic thud of a maul striking wood. Andrei Mocanu, a man built as solid as the timbers he worked, was setting the last of 6 enormous cedar posts into the marshy ground. They were not foundation stones for a sill, nor were they corner posts for walls. They stood alone, 4 feet proud of the sucking soil, arranged in 2 parallel rows. They looked less like the beginning of a home, and more like a strange, unfinished pier destined for a river that wasn't there. Hollis Vanatter, the county road overseer, pulled his wagon to a halt, the iron-rimmed wheels sinking slightly into the track. He was a man whose profession was a constant war against water and frost, and he knew the behavior of this ground better than he knew the scripture. He watched Andrei for a long moment, his face a mask of practical skepticism. "Mocanu," he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who directs crews. "What in God's name is that?" Andrei straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He nodded, a polite greeting. "My house," he said, his English still holding the shape of his native Romanian. Vanatter let out a short, incredulous laugh. He gestured with his whip at the posts. "On stilts? Here? You're a carpenter, they say. You should know better." He was joined by Jedediah Crane and Silas Putnam, neighbors who had paused their own work, drawn by the strange construction. "It is a foolishness, Andrei," Putnam said, shaking his head. He was a good man, but one who trusted only what he had seen work before. "The ground here moves. It'll heave those posts 6 ways from Sunday come the first big freeze." Vanatter pointed a thick finger at one of the cedar trunks. "I've seen it 100 times. The frost will get a grip on that post 4 feet down. It'll lift it, sure as sunrise. Then comes the spring thaw, and it won't settle back level. By July, your cabin will be racked so bad you won't be able to shut the door. Your sills will split right down the middle." He spoke with the absolute certainty of experience. This wasn't malice. It was a professional warning, a statement of physical law, as he understood it. "He's right," Crane added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "You're building your family a trap. That thing will be kindling by next summer." The word on the marsh was that the Romanian was mad, building a house in the air, a house with no proper foundation, a house that invited the winter wind to steal the heat right out from under the floor. Andrei Mocanu looked at the 6 cedar posts, standing straight and true. He looked at the worried, mocking faces of his neighbors. He had heard their whispers, felt their stares. He simply picked up his adze and turned back to his work. "The ground will not touch the house," he said, more to the wood than to them. The mockery would last through the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. What did this Romanian duller, this carpenter from the wet valleys of Maramureș, understand about the physics of conductive isolation that the most experienced men on the Kankakee had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the simple, profound principle of the thermal break, a concept this immigrant woodsman understood in his bones long before scientists gave it a name. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of those who survived on the edge. If you value these stories of ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss an episode. Now tell me in the comments, what's the most unusual but effective building technique you've ever seen or heard of? Andrei Mocanu was not a farmer. He was not a trapper, nor was he a frontiersman in the way Americans understood the term. He was a dulgar. In the forested mountains of northern Romania, that word meant more than just carpenter. It meant a man who could read a tree from its bark, who could join timbers so tightly that a knife blade couldn't find a gap. A man who understood the life of wood and the weight of a house. His hands were not accustomed to the prairie plow, but to the familiar heft of a broadaxe, the precise bite of a chisel, the satisfying rasp of a hand-hewn plane. He had spent his youth raising houses not on stone, but on massive oak stolpi, or posts, lifting them above the damp earth of the river valleys, where floods and moisture were a constant threat. He had brought his wife, Elena, and their two small children, Luca and Sofia, to America for the promise of land. The parcel they could afford was here, on the edge of the great Kankakee Marsh, a place that reminded him of the river bottoms at home, but with a cold that was a different beast entirely. It was a wet cold, a cold that seeped and crawled and found its way into everything. Their first winter in 1883 had been a lesson in that cold. They had built a small, tight cabin the way his neighbors advised, with log sills laid on a foundation of fieldstones, the floor planks just inches above the dark soil. It was a catastrophic failure. That winter was a siege. The floor planks, in direct thermal contact with the frozen, saturated earth, were never warm. No matter how much wood Andrei fed into the stove, the floor bit at their feet with a vicious, relentless chill. Elena said it was like standing on stove iron left out in the snow. They wore their boots from the moment they rose from bed until they returned to it. The cold was an invading force. In the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, their store of potatoes turned black and soft with frost. The water in the bucket beside the stove, a mere 6 feet from the fire, would be skimmed with ice by morning. One particularly brutal dawn, Elena went to sweep the floor, and the straws of her broom, made brittle by the penetrating cold, snapped with a sound like cracking ice. That was the moment Andrei knew that the American way of building on this land was wrong. The problem wasn't the walls. The problem wasn't the roof. The problem was the floor. The problem was the ground itself. He had spent a lifetime learning how to keep a house dry from the ground up. Now he realized he had to learn how to keep it warm. The conventional failure of the cabins across the Kankakee Marsh wasn't a matter of poor craftsmanship. Men like Hollis Vanatter and Silas Putnam were competent builders. They hewed straight timbers, chinked their logs tight with mud and moss, and built roaring fires in their hearths. But they were all fighting the same losing battle, because they misunderstood the nature of their enemy. They thought the enemy was the cold air. The true enemy was the cold earth. The physics was simple and brutal. The problem was conduction. Heat, like water, always seeks the easiest path to a lower state. For the cabins sitting on or near the ground, the frozen, waterlogged soil of the marsh was a heat sink of near infinite capacity. It was a thermal vampire, constantly and silently draining warmth from anything it touched. A log sill placed on a stone pier, which in turn sat on the frozen ground, created a direct highway for heat to escape. The BTUs generated by a cord of precious firewood didn't just radiate into the room. They flowed down through the floorboards, into the joists, through the sills, and were wicked away into the vast, unyielding cold of the Indiana soil. Trying to heat a cabin built this way was like trying to fill a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom. The families on the marsh were pouring their energy, their laboriously chopped wood, into a system designed to fail. At the Putnam cabin, Martha Putnam spent her days stuffing rags and corn husks into the gaps between the floorboards, a futile gesture against an enemy that wasn't moving through the cracks, but through the solid wood itself. They burned nearly twice the wood of families on drier, sandier soil, yet their children were always coughing, their nights spent huddled together under every blanket they owned. The cold didn't just make them uncomfortable, it made them poor, burning through the fuel that was their primary store of wealth and winter energy. Andrei saw this and understood it was a war that could not be won with a bigger fire. It had to be won with a smarter design. He would not try to fight the ground. He would simply refuse to touch it. The construction of Andrei's new cabin became a piece of local theater through that autumn. The 6 cedar posts, chosen for their natural resistance to rot, were sunk deep below the expected 4-foot frost line. Their bases widened and set on a bed of gravel for drainage, a detail no one saw. Upon these posts, Andrei and Elena, using a system of levers and sheer will, hoisted the massive hand-hewn sill beams. Then came the floor, the part that baffled everyone. Instead of laying planks directly on the joists, he first created a lattice of thin, pliable willow saplings across the bottom of the joists. This created a shallow basket between each timber. All through September, Luca and Sofia were put to work on a task that seemed bizarre to onlookers. They mixed clay, dug from a pit near the river, with water to create a thick, gluey slip. Andrei, meanwhile, took scythes of straw and soaked them in this slurry until every stalk was coated in a thin film of wet clay. He then packed this mixture, straw clay, or chirpichi, as it was called in his homeland, into the baskets formed by the willow lattice, pressing it up from below until it was 5 inches thick, flush with the top of the joists. It was heavy, messy work. Hollis Van Adder rode by one afternoon and saw Elena, her arms covered in mud to the elbows, passing clumps of the stuff up to Andrei. "You're packing your floor with mud, Mocanu?" Van Adder called out, unable to hide his astonishment. "That'll be a frozen block by Christmas. It'll draw the damp right into your timbers." "It will be dry," Andrei replied calmly, tamping the mixture into place. The straw gives it air. The clay gives it body. He left it to cure for 3 weeks in the dry autumn air. The clay hardened, shrinking slightly and binding the straw into a lightweight, surprisingly rigid slab that was more air than earth. It was an insulating quilt woven from dirt and grass. Only after this underfloor was bone dry did he finally lay his floorboards. Tongue and groove planks he had milled himself, tight and smooth. The final and strangest piece was the skirt. Andrei took large slabs of poplar bark, flattened and dried, and tacked them to the outside of the frame, hanging from the floor down to about 6 inches from the ground. It didn't seal the space completely, but created a screen, a barrier. "Now he's building a fence to keep the mice warm," Jedediah Crane was heard to remark at the trading post. The consensus was that Andrei Mocanu wasn't just eccentric, he was inviting disaster. His floor was held up on sticks, insulated with mud, and skirted with bark. Every known principle of sound construction on the Kankakee had been violated. Van Adder made his final prediction to a group of men at the crossroads. "When the thaw freeze comes, that ground will heave and those posts will dance. He's built his family a house of cards. It's a professional shame." Andrei heard the talk. He saw the pitying glances. He simply continued his work. He was not building for them. He was building for Elena and Luca and Sofia. He was building against the memory of snapping broom straws and blackened potatoes. What his neighbors saw as madness was, in fact, a sophisticated, multi-layered defense system based on a deep, intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. Andrei Mocanu was waging a war against heat loss, and he was fighting it on 3 fronts. The primary enemy, as he had learned in his first brutal winter, was conduction. This is the transfer of heat through direct physical contact. The damp, frozen soil of the Kankakee Marsh was an exceptionally good conductor. When a standard cabin sill logs rested on stone piers, heat from the floorboards would flow directly into the logs, then into the stones, and finally be sucked away by the earth. It was a continuous, unstoppable drain. Andrei's first and most dramatic solution was to sever this connection entirely. By lifting his cabin 4 feet into the air on 6 cedar posts, he created a massive air gap. Air is a terrible conductor of heat, roughly 20 times less conductive than wood, and hundreds of times less than damp soil. He had effectively created a demilitarized zone between his living space and the heat-sucking ground. He had severed the thermal bridge. But Andrei knew that wasn't enough. Heat doesn't just travel through conduction, it also radiates. A warm floor will radiate its heat downwards into the air beneath it. If that space is open to the winter wind, that radiated heat is immediately stolen and carried away. This is where the next two layers of his system came into play. The 5-inch thick quilt of straw clay he packed between the floor joists was the heart of his innovation. While his neighbors saw mud, Andrei saw millions of tiny air pockets, the individual stalks of straw, each a hollow tube, trapped air. The chaotic matrix of the packed straw trapped even more air in the spaces between the stalks. These pockets of still air are what gives straw its incredible insulating power. The clay acted as a binder, holding the straw together and adding a degree of thermal mass and fire resistance. This quilt was a formidable barrier to radiant heat loss. Any heat that radiated down from the floorboards would be trapped in the straw clay matrix, warming it slightly and slowing its escape to a crawl. The final piece, the bark skirt, was a stroke of genius his neighbors mistook for decoration. It addressed the third mode of heat transfer, convection. Convection is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, like air. A harsh winter wind blowing under his cabin would create convective loops, scouring away any warmth that did manage to escape the floor. The bark skirt didn't seal the crawl space, which was important to prevent moisture buildup, but it stopped the wind. It created a pocket of relatively still, calm air under the house. This trapped air, warmed slightly by the minimal heat radiating from the insulated floor above, became its own insulating layer. Andrei hadn't just built a cabin on stilts. He had engineered a complete passively insulated foundation system. He had defeated conduction with the air gap, radiation with the straw clay quilt, and convection with the bark skirt. He had built not a house of cards, but a thermal fortress. That winter announced its arrival with a deceptive mildness. The first week of January brought a strange, unseasonable thaw, accompanied by 6 straight days of rain. The marsh, already saturated, became a world of standing water and liquid mud. The ground drank until it could hold no more. Then the hammer fell. A front swept down from Canada, a wall of Arctic air that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in 12 hours. By the second night, it was minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was a physical force, driving the cold into every living thing. The effect on the waterlogged ground was cataclysmic. The moisture in the soil, expanding as it turned to ice, began to move the earth itself. It was the exact thaw-freeze cycle Hollis Venator had predicted, the ultimate test of any foundation. All across the marsh, the sound of splitting wood cracked through the frozen nights. At Silas Putnam's place, a massive sill log, heaved up by a frost-gripped cornerstone, gave way with a report like a gunshot. A 6-inch gap opened in his floor. At the Crane Homestead, their front porch tilted upwards at a drunken angle, ripping away from the main cabin. It was a time of misery, of families huddled around fires that seemed to give no heat, of listening to their homes groan and break around them. Inside the Mocanu cabin, a different reality prevailed. The fierce wind howled around the corners of the house, but it could not get underneath. The bark skirt deflected its force, leaving the air in the 4-foot crawl space relatively still. The ground outside was frozen solid 4 feet down, but the earth directly under the footprint of the house, protected from the wind and sky, was measurably less frozen. Inside there was a profound and shocking normalcy. There was no battle being fought. Andrei sat at the small table, carving a wooden spoon for Sophia. The air was cool, but not cold. The stove glowed with a small, steady fire. consuming wood at less than half the rate of his neighbors. The true miracle was the floor. It wasn't warm to the touch, but it was neutral. It didn't steal heat. It didn't bite. Elena moved about the cabin in her stocking feet, preparing a stew. The smell of onions and simmering beef filled the single room, a domestic comfort unthinkable in the frozen cabins around them. Luca and Sophia played a game with dried beans on the floorboards, their hands ungloved, their breath not misting in the air. The definitive proof, the experiment Andrei had set up, sat on the floor in the far corner of the room. It was a shallow pan of milk Elena had set out for the next day's cheese. In any other cabin on the Kankakee that morning, it would have been a solid, tin-cracking block of ice. In Andrei's house, when Elena checked it at dawn, a thin, delicate skin of cream had formed on the surface. The milk underneath was still liquid. The cold had been held at bay. It could not climb up through the floor. 2 days after the temperature bottomed out, Hollis Venator saddled his horse. His work as road overseer in these conditions was a grim accounting of damage. He rode a circuit, noting split bridges, heaved culverts, and impassable roads. He also made it a point to check on the homesteads. He wasn't riding to gloat. He was a responsible man, and he was genuinely concerned that the Romanian's folly might have collapsed, injuring the family. He fully expected to find a catastrophe. His ride was a tour of destruction. He saw the damage at the Crane place, the shattered sill at Putnam's. He saw cabins where the doors were jammed shut, the frames twisted out of plumb. The evidence was everywhere. The ground had moved, and it had taken the houses with it. He steeled himself as he approached Mocanu's property. From a distance, the cabin stood, which was a small surprise. But the real damage, he knew, would be in the details. The racked frame, the posts tilted from the heave. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. Andrei's cabin looked preternaturally calm in the frozen landscape. Venator walked around it, his expert eye searching for the telltale signs of strain. He saw none. The walls were straight. The roofline was level. Baffled, he decided to inspect the foundation, the point of failure he had so confidently predicted. He ducked under the bark skirt, stepping into the space beneath the house. He entered expecting a scene of chaos. He braced himself to see cedar posts angled in their holes. The ground around them buckled and swollen with frost, ice clinging to the underside of the floor joists. The reality beneath the cabin was so profoundly different from his expectation that it stopped him cold. The 6 posts stood perfectly, mathematically plumb. The ground around their bases was frozen, yes, but it was level. There was no sign of heave. And the air was still. It was cold, but it was a dead, motionless cold, utterly different from the biting, wind-driven air outside. Frost fog from his own breath rimed the brim of his hat, but the space around him was clear. He took off his thick leather glove and reached up, his movements slow and deliberate. His mind was struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. He pressed his bare palm against the underside of the straw clay floor. He expected a cold that would sting, a dampness from condensation. Instead, his hand registered a surface that was dry and, impossibly, not cold. It held no warmth, but it also stole none from his skin. It felt neutral, inert. It felt like a barrier. Andrei must have heard him, because the cabin door opened. He came around the side of the house and saw Venator standing there, staring at the underside of the floor, his bare hand pressed against it. Venator slowly pulled his hand away and stood up, emerging from under the house into the biting wind. He looked at the perfectly level sills. He looked at the plumb posts. Then he looked at the quiet Romanian carpenter. For a long moment, the road overseer, a man of loud certainties and practical declarations, was silent. The evidence of his own senses had dismantled a lifetime of experience. The ground had heaved everywhere, except here. The cold had broken everything, except this. He finally found his voice, shaking his head in slow disbelief. He wasn't looking at a structure of wood and mud anymore. He was looking at an idea, a profound, world-altering idea. "My God, Mocanu," Hollis Vanatter said, his voice raspy with awe. "You didn't build a cabin, you built an ark." The conversion of Hollis Vanatter was as total as it was sudden. He became the technique's most vocal and credible advocate. Where his mockery had once been public, his praise was now evangelical. At the trading post, at Sunday service, on his rounds as road overseer, he explained what he had seen. He spoke not of Romanian foolishness, but of Romanian genius. He described the plumb posts, the dry air, the floor that did not bite. Coming from him, the man whose job was to understand the ground, the testimony was irrefutable. He couldn't fully explain the physics, but he could describe the results. He told Silas Putnam, "Your heat is bleeding into the ground, Silas." Mocanu, he lifted his house right out of the battle. The true vehicle for the idea's spread, however, arrived with the spring thaw. Father Constantine, the Romanian Orthodox circuit priest, made his way to the Kankakee settlements for Pascha, the Orthodox Easter. He was a vital link for the scattered immigrant communities, a carrier of news, letters, and faith. He stayed, as was tradition, with the Mocanu family. He arrived expecting the usual hardships of a frontier cabin, but instead found a home with a dry, comfortable floor and a lingering, even warmth. He was a learned man, and he listened intently as Andrei, with Elena helping to translate the finer points, explained the principles of the stalpi, the straw-clay chirpishi, and the bark skirt. Father Constantin saw more than a clever house. He saw a key to survival for his parishioners, many of whom were struggling on marginal, marshy land just like this. When he left a week later, he carried not just blessings, but a set of detailed drawings Andrei had sketched on a piece of smoothed poplar bark. That spring, on his circuit through the wetlands of northern Indiana, he shared the design. He spoke of Andrei Mocanu's ark during his visits to 3 other Romanian families settled in the marshes of Lake and Porter counties. By the time the first snows of 1885 threatened, 3 new cabins were rising on cedar posts, their floors insulated with the humble genius of straw and clay. The idea was beginning to spread, carried by a man of God who recognized a practical miracle when he saw one. The quiet carpenter from Maramureș, using materials available to any settler, clay from the riverbank, straw from the field, bark from the woodlot, had engineered a solution that anticipated modern building science by nearly a century. Today we call his principles by technical names. The 4-foot air gap is a ventilated crawl space. The refusal to let wood touch the ground is a thermal break, a foundational concept in high-efficiency construction designed to stop conductive heat loss. His straw-clay quilt was a handmade, site-built structural insulated panel, or SIP. His bark skirt was a rudimentary but effective rain screen and wind barrier. Without formal training, without scientific instruments, Andrei Mocanu had intuitively designed and built a high-performance, passively heated foundation system, a feat of engineering that would not become common practice until the energy crises of the late 20th century. There is a lesson in the 6 cedar posts of Andrei Mocanu's cabin that transcends engineering. The other settlers on the Kankakee Marsh saw the brutal winter cold as an enemy to be fought head-on. They built thicker walls, chinked their logs tighter, and burned ever larger fires. Theirs was a strategy of fortification, of direct confrontation. They stood their ground and tried to overpower the cold with sheer force. Andrei saw the problem differently. He understood that the ground itself was an unconquerable foe, an infinite reservoir of cold. To fight it directly was to waste one's life and warmth in a battle that could never be truly won. His solution was not one of conflict, but of transcendence. He recognized that you did not have to live in the territory the cold had claimed. With elegant simplicity, he chose to occupy the space just above it. The other men fought the cold where it was strongest. Andrei Mocanu simply stepped his family up out of its reach. If this story of quiet genius and practical wisdom resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten ingenuity. We believe these stories hold lessons that are more relevant today than ever. Let us know in the comments. What other old-world building techniques have you seen that solve modern problems in a simple, elegant way? We read everyone. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative clarity, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.